For our discussion on impulse and momentum, I want you to refresh your knowledge and refresh your understanding on the laws of motion. Okay, take note that impulse and momentum are just applications of the laws of motion. So you already know that we have 3 laws of motion. Good. So we have the first law, which is the law of inertia. The second law is the law of acceleration. And then the third law is the law of interaction. So kindly refresh your knowledge about the laws of motion, because that is very important during our discussion on impulse and momentum. So how are we going to define impulse and momentum? In physics, it has a very precise definition. So let us consider first the second law of motion. Familiar, may kayo mo sa second law of motion, no? Second law of motion tells us that the net force is equal to the product of what? It is equal to the product of mass and acceleration. I know you're very familiar with that equation. Murag mo ni ang pinaka-familiar ng equation sa physics. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. And again, this is the second law of motion. Yan. However, we already know that acceleration is defined as the final velocity minus the initial velocity divided by time. Diba? So during our discussion on kinematics, alam natin that acceleration is equal to final velocity minus initial velocity divided by time. So basically, we can just substitute this equation sa ating equation on the laws of motion. I-substitute lang natin so that we can derive another equation. So in this case, our equation becomes force is equal to mass multiplied by acceleration, which is final velocity, minus the initial velocity divided by time. Ayan. So ito na yung equation natin for force, the second law of motion. Good? Ayan. So we can distribute mass. Distribute natin si mass dito sa ating equations. And that becomes force is equal to mvf minus mvi all over time. Ayan. Take note of this equation because it is very important, especially when we will be solving for the force. So pakisulat ang equation na yan. Good? Ayan. So we can cross-multiply force and time. Cross-multiply lang natin yan, and our equation becomes force times time is equal to mvf minus mvi. Do you follow? So this is already our equation. mvf minus f times time is equal to mvf minus mvi. Take note also of this equation. That is very important. Remember that in physics, we can define the terms in the equation. Kagaya nung sa yung discussion natin on kinetic energy. Alam natin that kinetic energy is only derived based on the definition of work, or the potential energy. The potential energy is only derived using the equation for work also. So pwede natin i-name yung mga terms natin sa ating equation. For example, this term, force times time, yan. Force times time is known in physics as the impulse. Good? Force times time is known as the impulse. So basically, kapag makakarinig ka ng impulse in physics, impulse is just the product of force and time. Ayan. Good. So basically, the definition of impulse is from the definition of the second law of motion. Galing lang yan siya sa second law of motion. Clear? Now, how about our other term? If you notice, paulit-ulit, meron tayong MV, the product of mass and velocity. In this case, ito, MV mv. Do you follow? That mv is also known in physics as the momentum. Yan. Good. So basically, when you hear the word momentum in physics, that is just the product. Momentum, small letter P, is just the product of mass and velocity. Follow? So in this context, this is the final momentum minus the initial momentum. Yan. Kasi nga merong F, final, I, initial. Clear? Ayan. So as a whole, yung equation nito, ito na equation. As a whole, that equation is known as the impulse. Yan. Dito, impulse, momentum, theorem. Clear? So as a whole, this equation is known as impulse momentum theorem. But the definition of impulse and the definition of momentum is just from the definition of the second law of motion. Nakuha? So our third equation is force times time is equal to mvf minus mvi. Clear? Ayan. So basically pala, impulse is just equal to the change in momentum. Clear? Impulse, this is impulse, is just equal to the change in momentum. That's final momentum minus the initial momentum.